They are, the only company in the world that is more than $400 billion of revenue, where 80% of that revenue is hardware, and 90% of that hardware is in China, right? There's nobody else that fits that description. So they played a starring role in a way that nobody else did, right? I call them the biggest supporter of Made in China 2025, right? Xi Jinping's plan for Beijing to basically sever China's reliance on the West for advanced technologies, which is a crazy claim, I think, but well backed up, I think.
Hey， 大家好，我是范琪斐，
嗨，我是 Melody，
欢迎收看
匪夷所思。
好，今天我们阿姨想知道呢，想要介绍的这一位来宾他是加拿大人，他叫做 Patrick Mcgee 当然他是《金融时报》的记者这样子，那他写了一本书啦。叫做《苹果在中国》。
等一下，所以你过年是读这本书是不是？为什么贴那么多的？
这个是过年前就已经读完了。
我还以为你过年过得好硬哦。
这是过年前做的。然后呢，它中文名字虽然叫《苹果在中国》，可是大家看它的英文名字，他说 Apple in China，right？ 它下面讲的就是 The capture of the world's greatest company， 它用的是 capture 这个字，就是说中国是怎么样把苹果这个伟大的公司给捕捉的。
说到捕捉，我用 AI 查，AI 翻译用一个更精确的词叫俘虏。
俘虏，对 ，OK， 好，所以也就是说呢，苹果看起来就是在中国其实是越陷越深。刚开始的时候也许是互惠的关系，但是到最后其实是离不开的。All right， 好，那很多人都公认这本书是把这个就是苹果在中国的整个发展史写得非常好的一本书，而且呢，甚至是代表了就是整个中国制造业是怎么做起来的从这本书上面可以看出一个端倪来。那至于这 Patrick Mcgee 的简历，我交给Melody。
好 ，Patrick Mcgee 呢，他其实是《金融时报》的记者，那他是在《金融时报》里面专责报道苹果公司长达5年，所以他当然是最了解这间公司啦。但是呢，我之前有听过另外一个节目对他的专访，那是1年多以前。他说，其实他能够写出这本书，不只是因为他专责报道苹果公司而已。他在之前还有住过香港，派驻过德国，他就近距离观察到这些欧美的制造业如何进到中国，然后可能被中国吞掉之后呢，反过来反超欧美，所以他对这个过程其实是非常了解，他才有感而发写出了这本书。那只是题目标的是苹果这样。
OK， 好。那除了这本书之外呢，其实我最想跟他谈的是书里面没有写的。
OK，
比如说呢，美中对抗，他觉得谁会赢？
这脱稿演出你。
对，就是我希望他很了解嘛，所以我想要看看他的评断是什么嘛
，okay。
另外一个是，比如说川普想要把苹果整个搬回美国去制造，有没有可能？我想要看看他的说法。那更重要的是，比如说台积电会不会整个被川普规划旁听？我想看看他的看法。OK， 好，那接下来我们就来看看 Patrick Mcgee 是怎么说的。All right, so Patrick, please say hi to our audience.
Hello, nice to be here.
Hi, and nice to have you here.
Thank you.
Okay, so today we obviously is going to talk about your book. It's called, I think in Chinese, it says 苹果在中国 Apple in China. But I noticed that there's a little byline down here. It says that the capture of the world's greatest company.
Yeah.
So why you use the word capture?
Well, it's a perfect word for the context of what I mean, which is that China has become the only place in the world where Apple could plausibly make 230 million iPhones a year, especially at that quality, but in that quantity and at that cost. Even if you just wanted one of those three, I don't think there's any place on the planet where they could build them. So, I don't use this in the book, in part because it's cliche, but Henry Kissinger had used the analogy of, Westerners play chess, in Asia you play Go, and if you sort of think of what China has been able to achieve over the last 30, 40 years in its supply chain dominance, they are sort of just like wrapping, the industrial ecosystems around Apple's infrastructure, sort of putting Tim Cook into a bit of a straitjacket where he can't really move. I think the diversification efforts to Vietnam and India are far more hype than substance. So they're captured in that sense that they cannot decouple from China as much as they think they might need to.
Okay, so do you think China did this? They planned this. They do this on purpose, or it just happened to be that way? Is this like a planned scheme?
It's a bit of both. I mean, certainly in the early 1980s, when Deng Xiaoping is going to places like Japan and Singapore, he is seeing the automated manufacturing lines and saying, "This is what we need." Right? Like, we tried Maoist socialism; it's not working for us. So there was a deliberate plan to sort of lure in foreign capital. Right? It began with the Chinese diaspora, with Hong Kong, with capital from Taiwan. That's why it was the origins of why Foxconn is entering China in the late 1980s. Obviously playing a bigger role later in the book. So there was absolutely a plan to lure in foreign capital and lure in foreign expertise and have those people then train legions of Chinese people. But you can't say it was like this all smart, all-knowing directive, because even a city like Shenzhen grew at a pace that nobody in Beijing was expecting, right? So I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but in the early 1980s, they assumed growth to maybe 500,000, maybe 1 million people by the end of the century, and I think it was 7 million people, right? You had all sorts of grassroots movements of migrants sort of taking the opportunity to leave their village, to leave the rural hinterlands and go to Shenzhen. And so there's a real interplay between Beijing's directives, the local governments in places like Shenzhen that were allowed to sort of be more flexible, and then people responding to that, and then businesses responding to that. So in addition to the Chinese diaspora, you then had a lot of capital coming in from Japan. Panasonic was one of the earliest companies in the late 1980s. And then my book is really about how Apple, just more than any other foreign business, just began to understand what was possible in China. Even though they were kind of late to outsourcing, late to offshoring, the likes of HP had been in China since the mid-1980s. Panasonic being another company that was early, Motorola, but Apple was able to achieve sort of the full extent of what abundant, flexible, affordable labor was possible of making.
Okay, so we will talk about how Apple get this knowledge later on. But and first, but I have to say that in a phrase in Taiwan, we say 养套杀, which means that you understand what that means.
I use it in my epilogue.
Okay. 养套杀, you raise it, you trap it, and then you kill it and then eat it at the end. Okay, so could we use this like on this the SOP applied to Apple or even Tesla?
Yeah, well, that is the phrase. I mean, I don't know what the origin of the phrase is, but it's used by Chinese businessmen. So in a certain sense, that tells you everything you need to know. If you wanted to be generous, and I think as a journalist, I like to have both the generous take and the cynical take, you could say that maybe in the 80s and 90s, what the Chinese were thinking was that the foreigners would use the Chinese market and export, and the Chinese would learn, their half of the business through the joint venture, and then they would, saturate their own market, right? And that could maybe live in harmony. But I think the Chinese companies quite naturally, now that they have saturated the Chinese market, they are looking to export something like electric vehicles, throughout Europe, maybe in North America if they can.
So you said that, Apple being able to maximize the knowledge about China, that's how they can be so dominating in this area. And but why is it among so many different countries? I mean, so many different companies from so many different countries. Why Apple stand out?
So this is why, the book really goes back to the 1990s to give a full sort of 30-year history. They're almost bankrupt in 96, 97, and again after the dot-com crisis in 2000.
I remember those times.
Yeah, I mean, just absolutely wild.
I regret it every day. I didn't buy their stuff. But anyway.
Well, but what people forget about it is that in those years, that's when Foxconn and Apple begin to have this relationship. And so often the assumption, especially among younger people who don't know the history, is that Apple was always this big company and then it moved to Asia for strategic reasons. And no, it was like a failing company. And they really bet the company on this one hit product. And it was only going to be a hit if you could build it, right? And if you could do it at scale. And so they're not really in China at this stage. And Foxconn's not part of the picture. This is LG in Korea. But you're asking sort of what made them different. Well, I mean, I sometimes joke with audiences, like, what's your favorite Dell computer from the early 2000s? And of course, nothing comes to mind, right? I mean, you'd be hard pressed to name a model or anything. And so when a company like Dell goes to China, they're basically just using it for margin and scale, right? But they're not redesigning, they're not reconceptualizing what a computer should look like in the 21st century. And that's the genius of Steve Jobs, right? Working with Johnny Ive. they are trying to push something like plastic injection molding or metal stamping or tool and die making to just the utmost limits to really have a certain aesthetic quality to them, right? So Steve Jobs would famously care not just about the back of the computer, what the appearance was, but the insides. He cared about the color of the cords, right? The wires within the computer. And so if you take that mentality and you build a computer in a different country, that country, no matter what we're talking about, isn't going to be capable of pulling it off because they're doing something that is like breakthrough after breakthrough. And so Apple's solution to this is to have what literally becomes plane loads of people, engineers, flying over to these various countries to build, right? To teach engineering 101. And eventually, once they have enough money, they're literally purchasing machinery and putting it on the production line of several countries, right? I mean, Taiwan is an instrumental character in the first 5 years of Steve Jobs' comeback. So that's just not something you were seeing at Dell or HP. And you know, why would you? When you're doing things in a manufacturing sign that the Japanese called poka-yoke, where if you're putting, let's say, a flat panel onto the side of a computer, poka-yoke would mean that if you put it upside down, maybe even backwards, it would still fit, right? So it was idiot-proof. Nothing about making Apple products is idiot-proof. It's really intricate.
So in this process, except that Steve Jobs really like fixating on like making things like 100% his way, okay?
Yeah.
And then what bigger role you think Taiwanese companies playing this, building the Chinese manufacturing industry? Did they become a giant? How big a role you think this time? I'm not talking about Foxconn only.
Yeah.
Or I'm talking about, I think all these Taiwanese companies went there and then they all helped. So how big a role did they play?
Yeah, enormous. I mean, I don't think you have most of the Apple products we think of today without the Taiwanese. As Thomas Friedman would argue in the 1990s, like two countries that both have McDonald's aren't going to go to war with one another, right? If you have mutual relationships, you have entrepreneurs going between countries, they're not going to want to go to war with one another. And so, you know, I think America kind of plays this starring role, bringing West Germany into democracy, Taiwan into democracy, Japan. The sort of fascinating history is that in order to help Japan, you have engineers from America flying over to begin building up like their radar and electronics industry. And that becomes instrumental to why the Japanese become so good in manufacturing chips in the 1970s. Right? There's almost a sense that we taught the Japanese too well, right? This is partly in the book Chip War by Chris Miller. And the Japanese are the ones who start going to their former colonies, Korea and Taiwan, and teaching them because the entrepreneurs in Japan are finding that the wage is much, much lower in those countries. And then, so in a certain sense, as those countries build up their competencies, the Taiwanese in particular take advantage of China because they speak the language, right? You've got way, way lower rates. And Taiwan is just so small. I mean, if you're working with these major multinationals, it's a little island versus the industrial potential of China. So that sort of whole interplay becomes what's fascinating, where the Taiwanese really have the know-how, right? They've got the knowledge, but they don't necessarily have the scale for execution. And China doesn't have the knowledge, but they have the scale. And the Taiwanese, the Taishung, are able to take advantage of that.
But, you know, I think among all these Taiwanese companies, we have to talk about Foxconn.
Yeah, of course.
And in your book, you talk about Terry Kuo, okay, being very frugal. He saved all these costs so that he could really produce better things for his customers. But in Taiwan, I think we have a different perspective.
Okay.
We think he is a lot of people think he is a very mean employee.
Sure.
And then he squeezed his labor really hard.
Yeah.
Okay. But I like to know, is that the key for him to build this empire?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're going to work with Apple, they are going to force you to make all sorts of investments, such that sometimes companies are actually losing money just to be part of the Apple supply chain. And so the forcing function of being so ruthless in the negotiations is that the counterparty, Foxconn in this case, has to find all ways of figuring out the logistics, the infrastructure, et cetera, that is actually going to be on the sort of like demanding schedule, but also like the low cost that they have to actually work with. for Apple, right? To actually make some money out of it. I mean, there's none in the book, but there's multiple instances that I'm aware of where Terry Guo would personally fly to Cupertino and try to negotiate better terms with Tim Cook and just not be able to do it because the lure of working with Apple is too big, and Apple just knows that, right? That if they want to go to Quanta or Pegatron or Wistron instead of Foxconn, like that strikes fear in the heart of Terry Guo. But I think he's absolutely instrumental, and Foxconn's absolutely instrumental. And of course, China's instrumental. So I mean, so they all sort of come together. But yeah, I mean, he's so frugal. I mean, the funny anecdote that I get from another Foxconn executive was that you would see the color of the soap dispensers in Foxconn changing because there was a directive to save costs, and so they were putting less and less soap and more water. Right? I was at a Taiwanese restaurant. We talked about the golden ratio, right, for the the dip, and they weren't obeying the laws of the golden ratio for the soap, right? So this person says, got down to one molecule of soap and then all water. That's just the extent to which the sort of penny cost saving that he was doing.
Yeah, and then I think his knowledge about China also helped, right?
Yes, that's something that I wasn't aware of at all. Having been an Apple reporter for several years before I went out to write the book. I mean, I think everybody is at least aware that Foxconn is the company, more than anyone else that Apple has outsourced to. And a sort of big revelation, and it makes all sorts of importance in the book, is that they hadn't just outsourced their manufacturing to Foxconn. They'd really outsourced their government relations, right? Their political liaisons and so forth. And so among the reasons why Foxconn was so adept at negotiating deals in China in a way that the other companies from Taiwan were not, is that they shunned what is called the ODM model, original design manufacturing. So if we're talking about the mid-1990s, that was the model that everybody in Taiwan operating in China was trying to move towards to. So original design manufacturing means that you're wanting to get in the business of actually designing the computers. And in a sense, these lazy Western companies were more than happy to not just offload their manufacturing, but to offload the design, right? That's sort of like a higher margin thing. And so the Taiwanese were quite happy to play that role. But Foxconn didn't. Foxconn prized being an OEM, original equipment manufacturing. That's sort of a shunned model, that especially at the time. But the effect of it was that Foxconn's model was to really be vertically integrated and to sort of have a client like Apple become completely dependent on Foxconn. So I forget how many subsidiaries there are within Foxconn, but it's a hilarious number. I mean, it's countless. And it's because they would play such a role in procuring components and doing all sorts of different things. People think of them as just final assembly, and they do so much more than that. And the result of doing that is that you need a big footprint, right? You need a large campus. And so Foxconn was also instrumental, and this is pretty famous, of building dormitories for the migrant workers, right? So that everyone was accessible all the time. And so to get all that done, Terry Guo would work with the local government officials in places like in places like Shenzhen. And so there was just a lot more political work to do that the original design manufacturers were not doing, and that ended up being pretty instrumental. So to understand sort of Chinese capitalism, or maybe I should say Chinese communism vis-a-vis Soviet communism, Soviet communism was quite top-down, right? The Chinese communism is far more grassroots, where the local government officials, the city cadres, etc., have much more influence. And I think Terry Guo completely mastered that to Apple's benefit.
In your book, you also mentioned that the authoritarianism in China actually helped Apple.
Yeah.
Could you explain that to our audience, why you say that?
It's an uncomfortable point, I like to assume that the people at the top of Apple are pretty ethical people and would, prefer that that China would, allow more human rights and things like that. But it was really something that was convinced upon me that that Apple really benefits from there are never any picket lines outside of the many hundreds of factories that they control but don't own in China. You're not going to have worker protests. You're not going to have a free media. Apple's a very secretive company, and they don't want people to know how the sausage gets made. It is on the nightly news that people are suffering from silicosis. So yeah, I mean, it's an unfortunate reality, but it has helped Apple immensely that they're operating in an authoritarian environment.
So at the end, when we look back right now, do you think who is a bigger winner here, Apple or China?
That's a great question. I might reframe it a little bit. They're both winners, right?
Yep.
In economics, you talk about external negative externalities, right? You might even say collateral damage. And the collateral damage would be that Apple and other companies have been investing so much in China that they have not been investing in America's industrial heartland. I mean, I think you could make the argument that that's also what led to the rise of Donald Trump. It's your little doll there, I think, right?
Yeah.
And so the consequences, right? The second, third order magnitude impact of that, I think, is quite large. But yeah, no, my book has never been about, Apple's share price is about to fall or something like that. I think China has very much played the long game, and they've gotten a hell of a lot out of the relationship. But you can't say that Apple hasn't. It's worth $4 trillion and, just had a record quarter. It's the other countries that Apple didn't invest in. Including the United States, but also Mexico. I mean, Apple could have been investing more in like the NAFTA relationship and chose not to. So I think you asked about with hindsight, and I think as every year goes by, it's going to look worse and worse of how much we contributed to what I call Chinification rather than globalization over the last 30 years.
But, now I think time is very different because, Trump want Apple to make iPhones in the United States, okay, from beginning to the end. How does Apple going to get out of this political dilemma?
Well, Tim Cook and the Apple team have more than 10 years experience of how to deal with an authoritarian leader. So they're quite well placed with how to deal with Trump. And so we can all watch the same footage, right? Tim Cook went to the White House and gave Donald Trump a nice little plaque that has his signature on it and says made in the USA. So yeah, they're going to build the plaques in the USA, the bribes to Donald Trump in the USA, but they're not going to build the iPhones. And Trump has a pretty short attention span. He likes big numbers, right? So Apple first pledged $500 billion investment. Then they upped it to $600 billion. But there's documents of the big tech companies all came out just a couple days ago, and Apple is the only one among them where capital expenditures literally fell last quarter. They shrank, right? If those numbers that they're pledging at the White House were remotely true, the numbers wouldn't just be going up; they would be soaring. In fact, they're falling. That tells you everything you need to know about the dog and pony show that happened at the White House.
So, can you imagine Apple leaving China, though?
No. And why would they? They are, the only company in the world that is more than $400 billion of revenue, where 80% of that revenue is hardware and 90% of that hardware is in China, right? There's nobody else that fits that description. So they played a starring role in a way that nobody else did, right? I call them the biggest supporter of Made in China 2025, right? Xi Jinping's plan for Beijing to basically sever China's reliance on the West for advanced technologies. Which is a crazy claim, I think, but well backed up, I think. Even if you had a magic wand where everything could be built all of a sudden tomorrow in India, you still wouldn't do it because they have a $70 billion business there, right? China revenues, or maybe it's iPhone revenue within China, shot up by 38% last quarter. Would you say no to that business? Well, Apple wouldn't either. Yeah.
But I think they are trying. Do you see them trying at all?
No.
Okay.
I see them playing the PR game so that people think they're trying. And I don't think they really are. I mean, to be fair, some of the efforts are real, but this is in a certain sense where India isn't really living up to the standards or really going through the details the way that China had. So sometimes I would speak to people within Apple, and they would basically talk with a certain hubris that they could just take the playbook over the last 25 years and apply it to India. So in other words, Apple sort of looks back at the iMac to, iPhone 17 era and says,
yeah, maybe.
Look how well we did.
Right.
We can go do this somewhere else. I don't think they're giving China credit, right? China was, I want to say once in a century partner, but more than that, once in a 10,000 year kind of partner. Nobody else is thinking about manufacturing the way that China is. Nobody else is bending over backwards. Nobody else is really being humble about learning from everyone, right? When you talk to people in India, they don't want to learn from the foreigner. And I understand that. America doesn't want to learn from foreigners.
And also they are a democratic country too.
Which I hate to say is a deficit, right? You want that to be an advantage, but unfortunately, it's not. The government is really fragmented, right? There's God knows how many provinces, and they don't have the same there's something really efficient, there's something really effective. It's actually not efficient in China about how the local provinces sort of vie against each other, right? I quote a China expert in the book, Doug Guthrie, talking about how in the West, we think of capitalism as being about efficiency on the private side. Not efficiency so much, but dynamism. And he talks about how China came up with a capitalist model where the state was dynamic as well. You just don't have that in America, and you don't really have that in India.
Do you really believe in that, the capitalism in the state level? I mean, 国营企业, do you really believe in that model would succeed?
Well, it is succeeding. I mean, Made in China 2025 is wildly successful.
But I thought the general thought is that they are not as efficient as their private sector.
So that's a great distinction, right? So that's what I kept getting hung up on that word. So it's wildly effective, but it's not efficient in the sense that loads of money goes into ventures and a whole bunch of them will end up bankrupt. But the ones that win, right? They've gone through a sort of like hyper Darwinist evolutionary, competition. And once they've gone through that, like BYD, they're ready for the world stage. So, it's not effective in a sort of Western economic sense, but it's wildly efficient. And I think it's worth knowing that China's model of capitalism doesn't prioritize the things that the likes of Apple or Amazon or Tesla prioritize, which is to say they don't care so much about shareholder dividends and quarterly returns. They care about competencies. They care about chokeholds in the global economy. And so if you think of that idea that came from Stanley Shi in the early 1990s out of Taiwan, which was the smiley curve of product development, right? So this is like the value curve where product conception, product design was here, and then you would outsource all the things to Taiwan and later to China that were sort of not considered so valuable, and then you get back to retail and branding. I mean, Apple is the best example, basically, of all time of mastering those two valuable ends of the curve and outsourcing everything else. I think China, they learned this through practice rather than in theory. I don't think this is taught in universities per se, but I think they learned that at the national level, rather than the corporate level, the smiley curve is grumpy. That all the value is actually in the manufacturing and the logistics because you can employ millions upon millions of people and you can learn and develop all these competencies. So if you look at things that are necessary for like 21st century technologies, they're all doing really well in China, right? Whether it's chips or lithium-ion battery supply chain or solar voltaic cells or electric vehicles. I mean, China is dominant in most of those areas.
But do you expect that this dominance is going to go for a long time? People would say
unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah, you think so? So between the United States and China, the tech war we are talking about, so you think China is the winner at the end?
I'm almost certain about that. Yeah. I mean, just the basic statistics from UNIDO, which is an organization, a part of the United Nations, is that China in 2024 had something like 1/3 of all global manufacturing. And by 2030, it'll be 45%. No, sorry, 45%, which is what I was referring to earlier, that they're getting close to where America was at the end of World War II. The difference, of course, is that America didn't really want to be in that position, and so they wanted to create this sort of Pax Americana system where everybody benefited. I think China has a sort of 5,000-year history of a different model, which is the tributary system, where China sort of exists, in some sort of middle kingdom state, and everybody else is subservient in some way. I don't think you have to be a massive China hawk to sort of see like that's where history has been in the past, and I think that's where they want to be in the future.
But do you know? Because I talked to a lot of people about this same question. I have to say you are in the minority. Most of the people tell me that definitely the Americans are going to win because they are leading every step of the way. But you are saying that eventually the China will and the Chinese will win.
Well, what are you bullish on? Reindustrialization in America?
I'm talking about like this technology competition.
Yeah. Well, we could break it down in numerous ways, right? So in artificial intelligence, for instance, America keeps winning on like the frontier tech models, right? Creating the models.
Yeah, I thought that's the future.
Yeah, unfortunately, they're not creating any moats, right? Competitive moats. So the DeepSeek moment from 13 months ago was very much one of a Chinese company that most Westerners had never heard of. And it's not that they had matched, OpenAI or Anthropic, but they'd gotten pretty damn close. And since then, I think Alibaba and Baidu have demonstrated similar competence. And even Google's Gemini has developed, they might have even surpassed OpenAI. So in other words, they're sort of measuring the competition in a matter of weeks or months. And even David Sachs, like AI czar for the White House, has acknowledged that China is maybe 6 months behind. Okay, then you look at what China's doing. They're not winning the frontier model method, but they're not really even focused on that. They're focused on deployment, right? They're focused on diffusing AI throughout society, building things like robots, improving the efficiency of production lines and so forth. So, they're aiming for things that sound more mundane, right? Instead of the discourse being about, superhuman intelligence that will then sort of start thinking on its own and will have like the end of disease within 10 years. It's the kind of thing that Demis Hassabis has said at DeepMind. China's thinking about like, how do we, get a 3% quarterly gain on the production line using AI. But, in finance, you want something that compounds with time, right? A steady investment. That's how someone like Warren Buffett made their wealth. I think that's actually a far smarter, strategic, long-term thinking move than what the West is doing.
So you're betting on China.
Well, yeah, but I'm not cheering them, right? I don't have pom-poms out for China, but I think they've got a better strategy, and they're way better at executing.
Okay, that's okay.
I hope I'm wrong.
I also hope you're wrong too.
Look, by 2035, my biggest hope, right, for the book is that it was considered a sort of Cassandra call, and that it's basically been made obsolete by all the efforts and success in America, in Mexico, in India at competing with China.
Yeah.
I see no evidence in the last year that things are moving in that direction.
I think in Taiwan, everybody's concerned about Trump wanting TSMC to move the production to United States. Okay?
Yeah.
So I have two group of people tell me like totally different things.
Yeah.
One group of people would say that, Trump would never be able to succeed to take all the production to TSMC's, to steal our semiconductor industry to United States because TSMC has such a unique culture. And they can never be replicated. Okay, so there's one group of people.
Yeah.
And that's the other group of another group of people would say that yes, they could because the technology nowadays is different because of AI. So it's possible. I'd like to know, what do you think?
I don't think either side is right there.
Okay.
you need new friends.
So what do you think? What do you think that?
Well, first of all, I don't know anybody, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but I've never heard that that Trump or anyone else is trying to sort of replicate, all or take all of what TSMC is able to do in Taiwan, right? They're trying to bring back, which is maybe not the right term. It's the right term in the sense that America invented the semiconductor, but, the idea that like TSMC stole, the ideas or something from America is preposterous, right? And nobody should give that any weight. But, I guess Americans sort of lament that they lost out.
Right.
First to the Japanese and then to the Taiwanese. So, look, it makes all kinds of sense from a certain perspective that America needs to cut its dependence on one island, right, for 90% of advanced semiconductor production. So for TSMC to be expanding in, I think, Japan, Germany, and Arizona makes all kinds of sense. From a Taiwanese perspective, and you can obviously give this to me better than I can give it back to you, but I can understand why when TSMC is playing the role of Silicon Shield, well, you don't want to sort of replicate your technology in all these other places because then it diminishes the importance of Taiwan. From what I know of Arizona, it is never planned that they will have the leading node production in Arizona. And I think that's where you get the sort of perspective of Morris Chang, who's really not all that in favor of it, right? He's not the person making the decision. He's the founder. But I think that also diminishes how much diversification Apple is getting out of this deal because, Tim Cook was at the ribbon cutting ceremony and everything for Arizona. And it is a major investment. I think TSMC is investing $165 billion, right, which is rather astonishing. But for Apple's purposes, they're still going to be as reliant on Taiwan as really they ever have been.
So you think we're fine? Our semiconductor industry.
I wouldn't say you're fine.
So why? So what's your concern then?
Well, my concern is Xi Jinping thinks of Taiwan as a rogue province rather than an actual country. And Donald Trump, has moments where he's a big China hawk and moments where he's a real China dove. And at the end of the day, he's a real estate tycoon, right? He's a deal maker. I don't think he cares all that much about Taiwan. And so I worry about his trip. I think it's supposed to be planned in April, where he wants to make a big deal, right? Time is on Xi Jinping's side in a way that is not on Donald Trump's side. He has to worry about the midterms. He has to worry about the end of his second term. He wants to create a legacy. And I think he's willing to sort of like, make a big concession to get a deal done. And, hopefully the concession isn't Taiwan, but it's possible. I mean, I wouldn't be, I forget what term you used, but I'm not calm or pleased about the situation at all.
Okay. So so this is in Taiwan. A lot of people are worried about that. Yeah, because, Trump really wants a very big deal. So he would bargain Taiwan with it. So
I'm not saying he will. I'm saying
I'm just saying
I could use more
possible.
assurance that he won't.
Do you think, but there are people saying it's impossible because, Taiwan has been being too important strategically or because of our chips. So it's too important that Trump would never give it up.
So, and this is where Arizona is important, right?
Right.
If I'm TSMC, I would expand to Arizona. Right. I think that makes all the sense in the world that my biggest clients, Apple, Google, NVIDIA, are all American. So they want some chips more close to home. That makes business sense. I wouldn't want to give up the advanced nodes, and I wouldn't want to sort of expand so much that someone like Donald Trump would think, well, we don't really even need Taiwan. It's all in Arizona, right? I mean, chips are far more complicated than that, but I think that's the level of thinking that Donald Trump devotes to this.
But I'm worried that sometimes, maybe it's not our call. Maybe, yes, of course, we want to keep all the most advanced ones in Taiwan, but sometimes I do worry that, when forced, maybe you have to give it up.
I mean, Trump is an optics president rather than a substance president. So as long as the heads of TSMC are smart enough to realize that he can be placated with major investments without real movement behind them, then you're okay. But I also think your worry is appropriate. I don't want to say you shouldn't be worrying.
All right. Yeah. And then, so this is fun. This is really fun to talk to you because, you think very differently from most of the people that I talk to. So it's very interesting.
That's my poster at home. Think different.
Yeah. Right? Think different. That's good.
I've got the Dalai Lama on my wall, right? Because
I love Dalai Lama.
Well, because Apple used the Think Different poster with the Dalai Lama in the late 1990s.
Okay.
And then China said, why are you using the Dalai Lama? And they got rid of it.
Okay. All right. What we are really concerned nowadays, what we are really worried about is that when we lose that silicon shield, what we call the silicon shield, what's going to happen? But, you think it's possible that if Trump really wants a big deal, we might be the chip. We might be.
That worries me. I don't know what percent it is. I don't know that it's more than 50%, but it's not, 3%. Unfortunately, I don't think Trump cares much about Taiwan. Unfortunately, I mean, I do. I'm no defender of him.
Okay, so the other very popular thing is that the future world is going to be a dual track. One is American system, one is Taiwan, one is Chinese system. Do you think it will be the case? Like, it's going to be like two words. American word and Chinese word.
Well, I guess my hope is that, the White House would speak of America first, right? Or even America alone. But the sort of America that I looked up to, right, before maybe 2016, was that Pax Americana model of interdependence, right? So, for instance, when people talk about reindustrialization, I'm supportive of it to a degree, but I think ally shoring is just as good in a certain sense as reshoring. In other words, I don't think it really matters if America is dependent on some combination of Taiwan, India, Mexico, and other southern neighbors, or Canada, my native land, for a host of technologies, right? Because those are allies and you've got great partnerships. And so that's fine. I don't think you have to have everything in America.
But Trump doesn't think it that way.
He doesn't think like that at all.
Yeah,
so,
he doesn't think it that way.
But that's how America thought for a solid 70 years, right? So I want to return to that kind of model. But even if we just put this in the case of TSMC, it's not that TSMC has to choose between America and China, because the choice of America includes ASML producing the best machines that TSMC needs in the Netherlands, right?
Right.
It includes certain chemicals used for lithography in Japan and Germany, right? So there's a bunch of things that are really necessary to creating cutting node chips that go beyond just America. And then within America, you've got Cadence and Synopsys, which is like what everybody used for EDA, chip designing tools that are also necessary for TSMC. So there'd be a lot to lose were they to choose China, right? So my point is, just to simplify, it's not America versus China. It's kind of like everyone but China and China.
Yeah, but do you think China could independently grow a system of their own? Is that possible?
Unfortunately, yeah.
It is, right?
I think they're moving really quickly. I mean, it's like a whole nation effort, right? I mean, that's... their vision is like a autarky, right?
Okay.
Sort of vertical integration at the national level.
And do you think they are strong enough to go against everybody else? Because everybody else obviously now is using the American stuff.
It depends how to interpret your question, right? So if I'm being really literal about it, then I would say no. But China has a whole host of efforts, soft power and others, that would ensure that it's not versus everybody else. In other words, they only have one formal ally, right? North Korea. But they have
Russia.
I think that's not actually a formal ally in the sense of if you attack Russia, China isn't sort of immediately on Russia's side, whereas I think that is true in North Korea. But nevertheless, yeah, I mean, you're not wrong.
Okay.
Sure, and Iran would be a sort of another key ally. But the point is, the Belt and Road Initiative and other efforts they're making would ensure that if there were some sort of battle, it's not China alone. I think they have all sorts of economic interests and dependencies with places in Africa, in the old Silk Road, and other places. So, again, unfortunately, China is very competent, very smart, and very strategic.
And so, so that's China is very smart. They are very capable. How about Trump's wishes to bring the manufacturing back to United States? What do you think? Do you think he will be able to succeed in that? Some of that.
Well, some of it is coming back, right? So the research I was doing the last couple of weeks was just on the drone industry, and there's two major drone companies in California. And
so some industries,
so they do their manufacturing there. It's not that it's all gone, but when you get I always get asked if the iPhone's going to be built in America, right? And in a certain sense, it's just worth knowing that like the iPhone is like the pinnacle of industrialization. It's not the starting point, right? If Apple is going to be making a product in America, it'd be like AirTags, right? Or something like that. America doesn't have the industrial ecosystems to build the sort of scale that China is capable of. So one reason why the drone sector can be there is that you don't have any American drone companies that are even aspiring to build hundreds of thousands of drones per year, right? Apple builds a million iPhones a day, right? So it's a scale game. So you can say, let's have, drones built in America in a way that you cannot say that about smartphones. But you need a starting point. So it makes sense to have certain industries reshoring to America, or just maybe not reshoring, but just being invented and being built there. But when you talk to Americans, and this is my Canadianness coming out here, they're always wanting to invent their way out of a problem. That's where the focus is, right? The creativity of what gets called 0 to 1 sometimes.
Yeah.
And they're not thinking about 1 to 100, right? They're not thinking about the scale. And so even when you have someone like Johnny Ive and Sam Altman working together on what's supposed to be some breakthrough AI device, that hardware is not going to be built in Pittsburgh. I mean, I think we all know that.
But which one is more important, you think? From 0 to 1 or 1 to 100, which one is more important?
Well, in a certain sense, the essence of the Apple and China narrative, right, is that you had the ultimate 0 to 1 company doing all the 1 to 100 stuff in China.
Right.
So China didn't even have to be all that competent in thinking outside the box because Apple was doing it for them. So, I mean, they're both really important. Within Apple, you could say 0 to 1 is Steve Jobs, 1 to 100 is Tim Cook. Right? But I guess my worry is that we're getting to a state, maybe we're already there, where America still has some advantages in design and just creating things sort of out of the box. But they have no execution ability at scale. China clearly has the execution ability. I mean, no one's going to argue against that. And I think if they haven't already caught up with the creativity, with the design, et cetera, they will in the next 6 to 18 months. I mean, it's I think the best phones in the world are already from the likes of Huawei and Xiaomi.
Yeah, and then in your book, it's also you mentioned one point. I think it's very interesting. Is that you said that one country needs manufacturing industry because if you don't have any manufacturing industry, it diminishes your creativity at the end. Yeah, I read it to Chinese, so it's not your original English, but you got what I meant, right? I mean, do you agree with that? I think you quoted somebody.
Yeah,
saying
this sounds like so the term sometimes is shop floor innovation, and the person I'm quoting is Andy Grove, right? Who's one of the co-founders of Intel, and he wrote a fittingly titled "Only the Paranoid Will Survive." And his worry before he passed away was that if we're not actually building stuff, then we're not innovating on how it will be built. And what's interesting about that sort of criticism or prophecy is that that's not completely true of Apple because they have so many people in and out of the factories all the time that they do know how the innovations are taking place, and they do sort of handhold and do co-innovation with all sorts of companies within China to get it done. But of course, they can't do it without China as a partner, right? So Grove was worried that we wouldn't have the knowledge. And the interesting thing is Apple does have the knowledge, but they have none of the execution abilities. There's a sense sometimes with Americans that it's almost like the video game Age of Empires, where you sort of go through these sequences. And once you're beyond one sequence, we had a factory era of belching smoke factories, right? And then you sort of move on, and the services sector becomes big, right? And so in America, there are 3 major service sectors that are world leading, right? Hollywood, Silicon Valley, and the finance industry, right? And so you'd say, well, like those are thriving. They don't need manufacturing, right? But the degree of which they're dependent on manufacturing, I think, is really quite high. And in a matter of in peacetime, maybe the vulnerability is latent, but if it's ever to manifest, that's the big risk.
Okay.
So I don't know if you want to.
No, I understand that. Because when you talk about national security, then it's not about like saving how much money, the profit. Even it's not so profitable, you still need that.
Yeah, you have to sacrifice profitability for resiliency.
Right.
I mean, the clearest example of this is that when Donald Trump sort of thought he had the cards versus Beijing, he escalated tariffs to such a high level that Beijing didn't really have to do much in response other than say, okay, we're going to license, right? We're going to force a licensing regime for the whole world on rare earth magnets, right? And anyone having to sort of do the math, right, or the back of the envelope projections or whatever would realize that there's basically no rare earth mining in America. And even in the instances where there are, as soon as it's mined, it's sent over to China for processing. And that's one of the many chokeholds that China has. So again, I don't think it's necessarily matters if the processing was being done in Mexico, a nice allied nation. But if you're going to go head to head between China and America, I mean, the degree of leverage that China has in that relationship, I think, is like unprecedentedly high, and Washington officials are like literally learning it in real time.
Are you saying that China is actually having the upper hand right now?
Oh, I think they absolutely do. I mean, Trump completely folded last year. And again, Xi Jinping didn't have to do much. It was just a mere threat. Well, we're going to force you to license rare earths. And when China then backed down because Trump capitulated, he only backed down for a year, right? The idea is that we'll implement this in a year.
But why do you think there's so many Western media people are not saying what you are saying? I mean, I mean, a lot of people are saying that Trump is going to win. Trump is doing so well. So
I think they're wrong. But my perspective isn't. You're in a sense giving me too much credit, because when I talk to China experts, right, or people that are in the industrial sector, I talk to entrepreneurs, we're singing the same tune. I talked to someone the other day who said when Donald Trump, or sorry, I made the analogy that all Xi Jinping had to do was sort of lift a shirt a little bit to flex his bicep. And the person's analogy, so much better than mine, was, oh, he basically put like a piano over top of Washington, right? And basically just threatened to cut the cord.
Oh, whoa.
I mean,
okay.
so lots of people are thinking the way I am.
Okay.
It's the difference between sort of the people who study this versus the masses.
Okay. Very interesting. So this is our program's tradition. You know, if there's one, one concept, you would have our audience to take back. Well, what's the concept today?
I would go back to what I said earlier, because I think the thing that people don't understand about Chinese capitalism is profits are not the goal. Competencies, capabilities are. So sometimes even a prestigious publication like Foreign Affairs will look at, 14 different industries and rank them by American dominance, but the metric they're using is profit. And if you do that, then America seems like it's doing pretty well because they have profitable companies. But if they were to just switch the metric to competencies, you'd see that China is actually winning and accelerating where they are in many, many industries, and specifically the most crucial industries in the 21st century. So competency is not profit. That's how you need to look at China.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. 好，这个 take away 啊，我想讲几个印象比较深刻的啦啊。那其实，在书里面其实已经有提到啊，今天访谈里面他也有提到，他说苹果之所以成功呢 ，exactly 就是因为中国的这个威权制度。因为在中国你就是不能够罢工，因为在中国你就是不能因为环保而抗议，因为在中国你就是没有言论自由 OK、所以苹果呢其实是受惠于这个制度的才能够这么的成功。然后另外一个我其实比较惊讶的是他讲到中国的国营企业他觉得做得蛮好的
是
他觉得其实是成功的模式这样子。我必须要说，我们访问这么多人，他是非常少数这样主张的人。
对，
好，另外一个，我觉得我更惊讶的，就是说我们访问这么多专家里面，我在问到说美中对抗谁会赢的时候，他是唯一一个想都不想斩钉截铁就告诉我说中国一定会赢的人。
是没错，
对，可是
他的态度不是说中国好棒棒，中国好强这样。其实他讲的时候，他是很担心的，
他是担忧的，
对，他甚至一直不断用一个词叫做 unfortunately。
对，其实他是担忧的他并不是说中国好伟大这样，他其实不是这个态度
对啊，他甚至希望他的书只是一个就是我们那种预言失败那种鬼扯淡，他很希望他的书是这样。他最后就在聊天的时候还有讲。
可是我觉得如果你真的去看他这本书的时候，你就会知道，我觉得 Patrick 讲的其实还蛮有道理。而且我觉得最近呢特别看世界我们还写了一条就是有关中国天才班这条新闻。以前我们一直常在讲，就是说就是中国在0到1这个部分呢是输给美国的，但是在1到100就大规模的部分呢，他们非常强这样子。OK， 好，那就讲到就是人才培育的方式嘛中国现在发展出这个天才班的这种方法，它就是把全国的精英青少年聚集在一起，然后就是不管要花多少钱，反正就是全部用最好的方式、最好的老师去教育他们这样子。然后他们有很多是可以做0到1的。OK， 我看到这条新闻的时候，我觉得我必须要说 Patrick 的担忧是有道理的，是有道理的。OK，
但我觉得 Patrick 的担忧他其实是另外一个，因为你刚刚讲到0到1、1到100嘛，我记得他有提到说，其实对我们都以为美国擅长0到1，中国擅长1到100，所以中国会用力推0到1。Patrick 的观点其实是说，中国其实没有那么用力在推0到1，中国其实是把1到100做到极致的这个优点，其实就是说中国一直在推应用这一块。他说美国很擅长0到1，yes 没有错，但是你不会应用，那你的0到1有什么用呢？所以其实 Patrick 担心的是这个，也就是说所谓的制造是不是真的是一个国家可以强大的一个必要因素？他其实是认同的，
他认同的，他认同国家一定要制造业啦。对，他一定要制造业，不然的话没有制造业的话，其实是会影响到你的创意的。
对啊，因为台湾有一个微笑曲线嘛，他那时候他有提到这个东西，他说是台湾的提到微笑曲线，微笑曲线就是左边是品牌，右边是技术，中间是制造。那做制造的利润最低所以大家都集中在说把制造外包，苹果就是这样做嘛，然后我只追求品牌跟技术。可是他说Patrick 观点是说，中国在帮别人生产的过程中，他意识到从国家的角度，不是企业从国家的角度，你如果没有制造的话，你这个东西就不会进步。 我们之前访李文波也是啊，他就讲嘛，你不生产了，你不摸它了，那这个东西就不会前进了。对，
好，反正不管哪一个理论来讲，听起来，都好像是中国一定赢。
中国比较有优势。
对，中国
现阶段看起来比较有优势。
现阶段看起来美中对抗，那个就是以这几个理论来讲，就是中国会赢这样子。OK， 那。未来怎么样不知道啦
We will see.
We will see. OK， 好，那这个 Patrick Mcgee 显然是跟我们之前访问的很多专家想法不大一样。好，非常欢迎大家去看看他这本书啊，叫《苹果在中国》。OK， 好，那我们今天就聊到这边。所以喜欢我们频道的话，应该要
按赞、订阅、分享、抖内，
谢谢大家。